I've just finished my night shift and I've got a long road ahead of me, so I thought I'd record this, but I'm sorry in advance about the audio quality. I've not done much of this filming in cars type of thing, so I don't know how bad it's going to be. Worst case scenario, I'll put some subtitles, but yeah, let me know if this is a very bad setting for you and you can't hear anything. We won't do it next time. I just really want to talk about this topic, and I figured if I wait till I get home, I'm probably just going to go to bed, so you know, it's now or never. So I thought I'd do a video about studying while you're working, and this is something that I've been thinking about a lot because I think if you have certain misconceptions of what it's going to be like when you work, and if you try to copy paste your study system that you had in medical school, then there's going to be quite a lot of frustration, and it's just not going to work out. So over the last year and a half of working and also trying to consistently study and learn as I go along, I've learned a good deal of what works and doesn't work, and I thought I'd share that with you today. So the first thing that I really want to mention is about adaptability. Now, there is no way that you're going to be able to apply the way that you studied in medical school in the exact same way to your working life. It's just not going to happen. You're just not going to have that same amount of time. It's a different ballgame entirely. The key thing here really is adaptability. Knowing first and accepting that it's going to be a work in progress. Some weeks, something's going to work really well, and other times you're going to have to pivot and adjust. And I think that applies to anything in life, to be honest. Being able to adapt to the environment, to the state that you're in, and to just keep readjusting and readjusting. And that's really how you get as close to perfection as possible, because there is no one size fits all. And even for one person, there isn't a one size fits all your moods and all your contexts and all your situations. So before we even talk about any tips that I've picked up along the way, I think it's really important to be aware at least of this mindset shift that is needed, of being adaptable and knowing that you're going to have to adjust these techniques to be able to be consistent in your studying and learning in your own time. My second point would be to make it short. Gone are the days where you can have 2 to 4 hour blocks of studying consistently. It's, you know, unless you have a really chilled placement and, you know, you picked it specifically because you've got an exam to prepare for and you've got that amount of time to study, then it's just not going to happen. So again, here there's an element of lowering your expectations, and if you're aiming for 2 to 4 hour blocks, you're not going to do it. And 10 to 15 minute blocks throughout the day is much better than nothing, which is what you will be doing if you're aiming to do 2 hour blocks every day. And actually doing them consistently has been really the most useful thing to stay consistent and to keep learning on the job. My third point would be to make it personal. So instead of trying to get through an entire medical textbook and going from chapter 1 to chapter 658, try and make it as relevant to whatever you're doing as possible. So there's 2 ways that I do this. One of the best and simplest ways to do this is to just pick one of good way to stay relevant, because whenever there's a bit of a lull and you can go over something, just look at your list and you'll immediately have things that you know that you're not comfortable with, rather than just opening up a textbook or a website and starting to read about a condition. In the learning process, the key is really to identify your weak points and work on them. The problem with just passively reading a textbook is A, it's passive, so it's not going to really go into your head. But even if there's lots of things that you don't know in that textbook that you should know, so you're planning on going over the entire thing, the reason why it's not effective to just passively read is because you're reading things that you know and that you don't know, and you're not differentiating between the two. And I see this a bit like the whack-a-mole. I think it's called whack-a-mole. You know, when you've got these holes and a hammer, and whenever an animal comes up, you just hit it on the head. You're trying to find those gaps of knowledge. You're trying to find those holes, and the best way to find those holes is to test yourself. So before you read a topic, just think, what do I know about this? And just write it down. Or when you're working, you know, you write down, oh, this is something I don't know about, and that's your list of relevant topics that you can go over. And immediately you're jumping straight into the holes in your knowledge, instead of just looking ahead and thinking, well, I know there's holes in my knowledge, I just can't see them right now, so I'm going to start reading, and, you know, hopefully I'll find them. It's just very ineffective. My fourth point would be to make your studying measurable. So I find that oftentimes, like I said, the first point was about adaptability. I'll pivot and I'll change the way that I'm studying, and I'll adjust how long I'm studying for and the way that I'm revising topics. But a really important step that can be missed, and I think makes a big difference, is how to track your progress. So there's a billion different ways to do this. I'll tell you mine. But if you're not measuring or tracking your progress in some way, it may feel to you like you're not learning anything and you're not progressing. And you'll probably feel that even more than you may have felt in medical school, because now you're doing 10 to 15 minute blocks, which doesn't feel like a lot already. So it's really important to be able to track how much you're learning, A, to keep you motivated and to realize that you are learning things, and B, to assess if there's a more efficient way of studying, and that will help you to pivot and adjust the way that you're learning. So in my tracking system, I like to incorporate two things. So the primary purpose is to track my progress, but the secondary purpose is also to make sure that I'm applying spaced repetition and active recall to my sessions. If you're watching this, you probably know what these are already, but essentially to make sure that you're actively testing your brain while you're revising, rather than just passively, you know, reading something and highlighting, which is very ineffective. And spaced repetition, so essentially repeating these topics that you're going over over a certain period of time, or for example the day after, and then 3 days later, and then a week later, and a month later. There's lots of variations, but my tracking sheet essentially helps me do both these things. So what I do is use a Notion document. Now, Notion is absolutely amazing. This is not sponsored, but I really love the layout and how easy it is to use for revision purposes. So I used to have a Word document, but I just find that it's more flimsy and difficult to use in the way that I do things now. So I've got a list of common conditions that I've built up that I see on placement and that I want to learn about. And this is not an exhaustive list, you know, it's not going to be everything you need to know in a medical textbook. But it's the stuff that comes up very often that I want to make sure that I'm comfortable with, in terms of explaining it to somebody and knowing the investigations and the management, and having a list of differential diagnoses and little checks or red flags that I want to keep in mind. So I've got that list, and I will color code them. Now, this is not a complex color coding thing. I see people do some really complex, you know, very admirable things, but I just keep it really simple. So I just highlight the topic based on how well I know it, and sometimes I'll even put the date of when I went over it. So for example, you'll have like COPD, and I'll put the 5th of November next to it, and I will highlight it depending on how comfortable I am with it. So initially it's just going to be blank, and then or white, and then I'm going to make it red for the first time I go for it if I realize that my initial knowledge of the topic wasn't fantastic. And once I get more comfortable with it and I've gone over it, aka spaced repetition, so it'll become yellow, and then blue, and finally green. So that's my way of incorporating spaced repetition. Active recall I do just before I start a topic, any topic. Instead of just opening up a textbook or looking at a website, I'll initially just test myself and ask myself, what do I know about this? How would I explain it to somebody? And I always have like a scrap piece of paper, and I'll just write down initial things, so the definition, symptoms, differential diagnoses, investigation, management, things to watch out for. And depending on how bad this is, I will spend less or more time on this topic. And so that's the active recall. The spaced repetition is by highlighting and writing the date, so I'll know when I went it's really helpful to find little things that make it fun. So there's two things that I use to kind of switch it up and make it more stimulating and more fun. Number one, I've kind of already mentioned. I find that testing myself on any given topic, I just imagine that I'm going to teach it to a group of medical students, and immediately that wakes my brain up, and I'm trying to think of a good way to explain this to a couple of students. Sometimes I actually do explain it to students, sometimes it's just in my head on a piece of paper, but immediately I find that revision session is more challenging, more stimulating, and maybe you won't call that fun, but I think it changes things up a bit already. So it's a really important thing to try and do. I'm just realizing that maybe fun isn't the right words to use, more to change things up and to make it stimulating. Don't let your brain get bored. Just like a workout routine, if you do the same thing all the time, your body will adapt, it will get bored, and you will probably stop doing it. So here, by testing yourself, you're stimulating and challenging your brain a little bit more. And another thing I do is listen to podcasts. Now there's some really good ones, I'll put them in the description. One of them is called, I think, The Recess Room, and it's just a really nice way to learn. It's something I've started doing recently, but listening to experts talk about certain topics, I find the emergency setting, very, very interesting. Presenting a patient, discussing how you would approach things, what you definitely don't want to miss, and it's a teaching session, an interesting case study, and a good pastime while you're driving, all rolled into one, and I really enjoy that. It depends on your state of mind, but I think it's a really good idea that I hadn't considered before until one of my ED consultants sent me a link